Lisa, I want that report on my desk first thing tomorrow. No excuses. It was Sunday, 10:04 p.m. I stared at my phone, still buzzing with the notification. Another message from my manager, Rachel. Of course it was. 3 weeks into my new job and the mask was already slipping. After my husband and I were both laid off last year, I had been desperate for a fresh start. The role I landed at Aerden Tech was a step down, sure, but we had bills to pay, and the hiring manager, Brian, had seemed genuine and kind. At first, the team was great. Supportive, welcoming. It felt like a new beginning. But then came Rachel. Officially, I was hired as a project liaison between Brian's strategy group and Rachel's product division. But unofficially, I was Rachel's personal punching bag. That became clear very quickly. She'd email me at 9 p.m., call me at 7 a.m. on weekends, ask me to cancel time off, skip lunch, and reframe my documents to match her tone. But the worst part wasn't the workload. It was her tone, her words, her constant cutting remarks. You really should consider dressing for your body type. You're pretty sharp for someone without a technical degree. Brian must have hired you out of pity. I tried to push back, calmly, professionally. That only seemed to provoke her more. Every ounce of assertiveness on my part was met with a fresh storm of passive aggression or outright insults. I stayed. Because I had to. Because our mortgage didn't care about my pride, and we still hadn't recovered from the medical bills after my father-in-law passed. But something broke in me on a Friday afternoon. I had just wrapped up a team sync and scheduled a follow-up meeting without including one of Rachel's junior analysts. I didn't know the guy existed, but that didn't stop her from storming into the open office, voice sharp and loud enough for half the floor to hear. Do you even know what you're doing, Lisa? Who let you run meetings unsupervised? Honestly, you're an unqualified mess. I froze. People were staring. My hands shook. I walked straight into Brian's office and shut the door behind me. I didn't even sit down. I can't do this anymore. He looked at me for a long moment, then exhaled. You're not the first person to say that, he admitted. She's lost 4 people in 6 months. I was hoping it would work out better this time. He didn't hesitate. By that evening, I was reassigned to his team, officially out from under Rachel's supervision. I felt like I could breathe again. Finally. But it didn't last. The following Monday, I received an email from Rachel with a subject line that just said, urgent. Inside were bullet points, tasks, demands, as if nothing had changed. I didn't respond. That Wednesday, she showed up at my desk. So you're ignoring me now? She hissed, loud enough for my new team to hear. Is that how you operate? Play the victim, then pretend you're too good for the job? Before I could respond, Brian appeared behind her. Rachel, that's enough. She turned pale, but the damage was done. And still, it didn't stop. She kept emailing, kept circling like a shark that didn't know the meal was over. I tried to focus on my work, but the tension never left. 2 weeks later, I made a decision. I opened a blank document and typed my resignation letter. Simple. Director. But I didn't stop there. I attached a second file. A 3-page document listing every inappropriate comment, every after-hours demand, every documented case of verbal harassment I could recall. Dated, sourced, and clear. And then I hit send. Not just to Brian, to HR, to leadership, to Rachel's director. The responses rolled in fast. Some shocked, some supportive, some silent. Rachel stayed. I left. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't really gone. Not yet. I had already set something in motion. Something she wouldn't see coming until it was far, far too late. The first morning after I quit, I sat at the kitchen table in my robe, staring at a half-empty cup of coffee. My inbox was quiet. No late-night tasks. No urgent subject lines. No Rachel. It felt surreal. But peace has a funny way of turning into panic when there's no paycheck to back it up. We had just enough in savings to cover maybe 2 months of bills if we skipped anything extra. No dinners out, No impulse buys, no margin for surprise. My husband had just started a new job himself, but it barely covered half our monthly expenses. Things were tight, uncomfortably tight. And emotionally, I was drained. Leaving had felt like taking my first breath after nearly drowning. But freedom didn't pay the mortgage. I spent the next 2 weeks applying to anything that seemed remotely relevant. 5 applications a day, sometimes 10. I tailored every resume, rewrote every cover letter. Still, nothing. One afternoon, I was scrolling job boards when a LinkedIn notification popped up. David Montgomery has joined Aerden Tech as Chief Strategy Officer. I blinked. David Montgomery? The same David I used to work with 5 years ago at Stratix? The one who once pulled me into a high-visibility project that led to my first promotion? We hadn't spoken in ages, but we had stayed connected loosely. LinkedIn likes here, a random birthday message there. Without overthinking it, I sent him a quick message. Congrats, David. Hope Aerden treats you well. Let me know if you want any insights. I used to be there recently. I hit send and went back to job hunting. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was David. Lisa. Hey, wow, it's been what, 4 years? Closer to 5. I laughed. Feels like a lifetime. We chatted for 20 minutes. I kept it light, but I was honest. Told him I'd been there recently, that the culture had shifted, that certain leaders, without naming names, had caused turnover and morale issues. He asked thoughtful questions. I offered a few ideas on how Aerden could modernize their internal systems, how they could reduce redundancy between strategy and product. At the end of the call, he paused. You know, he said, I was going to hire a chief of staff, someone who can help me rebuild from the inside. I wasn't sure where to start looking, but would you consider coming back? I sat in stunned silence. Back to Aerden? I finally said. Under you? Yep. You'd be reporting directly to me. I'd make sure your title and compensation match your experience, and let's be clear, you'd be 2 levels above whoever made your life difficult. I'd want you helping drive culture change, not surviving it. It felt like someone had thrown open a window in a room I hadn't realized was suffocating me. I asked for a day to think, but I already knew. By the next afternoon, the offer letter was in my inbox. Director of Strategic Operations, reporting directly to the CSO. Salary nearly double what I was making before. Full remote flexibility, equity, bonus potential. I accepted. The onboarding moved quickly. And then, just 3 weeks after I had walked out of Aerden Tech with a cardboard box and a 3-page resignation letter, I walked back in. This time, through the front doors of the executive wing. David and I agreed to keep my return under wraps until the next all-hands strategy meeting. That gave me time to settle in, review internal documents, and start reconnecting with old contacts who were still at the company. But word travels fast. The day of the announcement arrived. I stood near the back of the large conference room as David took the stage. Before we dive into strategy updates, he said with a grin, I'm thrilled to introduce someone who's going to help us reshape how we think, operate, and lead. I saw heads turn as people scanned the room. Lisa Grant is joining us as our new Director of Strategic Ops. Some of you may remember her. The silence was thick. From the side of the room, I watched Rachel's expression shift. Confusion, disbelief, and then something else. Something sharp. She recognized the name. Then she saw me. Her face dropped. She blinked. Once. Twice. And then quickly looked away. I stood tall, calm, controlled. I smiled. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that this wasn't just a return. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Something she'd never see coming. The silence in the room after David's announcement was deafening. Rachel didn't clap. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply stared at the floor for a beat too long, her face carefully blank. But I saw it. The flicker of panic. The realization that something had shifted, and she had no idea how deep the change went. I didn't approach her that day. I didn't have to. My presence was enough. I knew her well enough to understand that being blindsided publicly would eat away at her far more than any confrontation ever could. The next few days were surprisingly smooth. David brought me into senior leadership meetings. I reviewed team org charts, process breakdowns, and internal communication channels. Every document confirmed what I already suspected. Aerden Tech had been bleeding talent for months. Morale was low. Turnover was high. Rachel's name came up repeatedly in exit interviews, often buried between layers of vague corporate phrasing. Leadership misalignment. Lack of psychological safety. Unclear direction with a punitive edge. In plain language, she was toxic, and everyone knew it. But no one had done anything. Not yet. I hadn't come back for revenge. Not exactly. I came back to reclaim my name, my dignity, my career. But if consequences were a natural byproduct of that, I wasn't going to stand in the way. It didn't take long before Rachel tried to reassert herself. 3 days after the all-hands meeting, she sent David an email. A long one. I only knew because he called me into his office and tilted his screen so I could read it. I'm concerned about Lisa's presence here. She used to work for me, and there were issues. She attempted to undermine my authority and left the company on difficult terms. I'm not sure she's suited for a director-level role. Just wanted to raise the concern privately. David raised an eyebrow as I finished reading. I assume this isn't the full story. I kept my tone even. Not even close. I thought so. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside was a printed copy of my resignation letter from 3 months earlier. The one I had CC'd to HR, leadership, and Rachel's own director. Attached were pages of documented harassment, complete with dates, timestamps, and direct quotes. She forgot we keep digital records, he said simply. I shook my head. She didn't forget. She just didn't think it mattered. Well, he said, it does. I left his office with a strange calm. Not victorious, not smug, just settled. A kind of validation I hadn't expected to feel. But Rachel wasn't done. She escalated. That Friday, she sent another email. This time to David and the chief people officer. I believe Lisa is using her new position to target me. I've heard from others that she's speaking negatively about me. I'm requesting an investigation into her behavior. It was laughable. I had barely spoken to anyone outside my department. David didn't respond. He just forwarded it to me with a single line. You don't need to reply. HR is already familiar with the context. I thought that would be the end of it. But Rachel couldn't help herself. The following week, during a senior leadership roundtable, she took a subtle dig. We were discussing a cross-functional delay in the product pipeline, something that originated from a lack of collaboration between her team and ours. I explained the gap, tactfully, but clearly. Rachel interrupted me mid-sentence. Maybe you're just not used to managing this level of complexity, Lisa. It's very different from administrative work. The air in the room went still. She had just implied in front of 4 VPs that I wasn't qualified to be at the table. And she did it with a smile. I didn't flinch. Instead, I leaned forward, met her gaze, and said, I agree, Rachel. Managing complexity requires collaboration. That's why I've spent the last week interviewing your former staff. None of them felt they could speak up when they were under your management. I'd be happy to share the anonymized insights with you. Her smile vanished. David spoke up next. That would be helpful, Lisa. Please compile those findings into a report and send them my way. Rachel, we'll schedule a follow-up meeting to go over next steps. Rachel didn't respond. Her posture stiffened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The meeting moved on, but the tone had shifted. She had tried to cut me down and exposed her own leadership failures instead. Later that day, David called me into his office again. I want to ask you something, he said. Off the record, do you think Rachel is still the right fit for this organization? I hesitated. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted to get it right. I think she was given every chance to change, and she chose not to. What happens next is up to leadership. But if you're asking whether she's a culture risk, yes, she is. David nodded. That's what I thought. He didn't say more, but the look in his eyes told me everything. Rachel's time was running out, and she didn't even know it yet. Rachel didn't speak to me for a full week after the roundtable. No emails, no passive-aggressive comments, just silence. But silence, when it comes from someone like Rachel, isn't peace. It's pressure. Pressure building behind a closed door. You don't know when it'll blow, but you know it's coming. I focused on my work. The strategy alignment project David assigned me had ballooned into a cross-departmental overhaul. I was meeting with team leads from engineering, data, marketing, and ops, and everywhere I went, I heard the same refrain. We've been afraid to say this before, but people started opening up to me about how they'd been shut down in meetings, about missed promotions, about late-night phone calls, demeaning language, mental health leaves, and quiet resignations. Almost every trail led back to Rachel. One afternoon, I got coffee with Jenna, one of Rachel's former analysts who had resigned shortly after I did. We hadn't spoken since I left the company. She looked surprised to see me in the executive wing. "Wait, you're back?" she asked. "Director of Strategic Operations," I said, trying not to smile too wide. Her eyebrows lifted. "Good. You deserve it." She hesitated, then leaned in. "You know she told people you got fired, right? After you left." I blinked. "She said you weren't cut out for the job, that she had to clean house." I didn't believe her, but she said it more than once. I exhaled slowly. "Thanks for telling me." "She's not well, Lisa. You know that, right?" "I know." That conversation solidified something I had already started. I began formally documenting, not for revenge, for accountability. Every complaint I heard, every story, every time Rachel inserted herself into someone else's workflow, undermined their authority, or retaliated subtly when she felt threatened. I logged it. David encouraged it, quietly. He never said the words "build a case," but he didn't have to. The writing was on the wall. Then, one morning, it happened. David forwarded me an email. Subject line, "Concerns regarding Lisa Grant." From Rachel, again. This time she'd gone full tilt. The message was 4 paragraphs long. She accused me of trying to sabotage her, said I was using my position to poison perception of her leadership, that I was obsessed with discrediting her, and had been trying to get her fired since I came back. David's note at the top was short. "Thought you'd want to see this. I've already forwarded it to HR." And beneath it, another email. From the Chief People Officer. "Thanks, David. We've seen a pattern. 5 complaints in the last year, all similar in tone. We'll move forward with the formal review." 5 complaints. I sat back in my chair. This was happening. Still, I kept quiet. I showed up to work. I led meetings. I delivered results. I didn't let her presence or the rumors she kept spinning derail my work. And that made her spiral harder. The day the company's quarterly newsletter went out, Rachel crossed a line she couldn't uncross. In the middle of a thread on company-wide leadership transitions, there was a short profile. Lisa Grant, our new Director of Strategic Operations, brings over a decade of cross-functional leadership to Aerden Tech. A returning face to the company, Lisa is known for her commitment to integrity, inclusivity, and operational excellence. I didn't write that. I didn't even know it was coming. But it set her off. That afternoon, David sent me a message. "You need to see this." Attached was another email Rachel had sent, to the CEO this time. "Lisa is manipulating internal communications. She doesn't deserve a leadership spotlight. She has no technical background and was previously managed out of her role. I'm concerned about the message this sends." The CEO didn't respond to her, but HR did. 2 days later, Rachel was placed on administrative leave. They didn't tell her why, but she knew. Because the day after she left, I found a sticky note on my office door in shaky handwriting. I hope this was worth it. No signature. Just spite. and still, no apology. But I didn't need one, because for the first time in over a year, I felt stillness. A weight lifted. Rachel was out. The investigation wasn't over, but it had begun in earnest. I walked into that Friday's leadership sync knowing the storm had passed. And I was still standing. Not just standing, leading. And for the first time, people were listening. Rachel was gone. Not officially. Not yet. But her sudden administrative leave had turned more than a few heads. Whispers trickled through the halls. People speculated, but no one said her name aloud in meetings. It was like she'd become a ghost overnight. Present only in the wreckage she left behind. I'd love to say I didn't care, that I'd moved on, that I was above it. But I'd be lying. Because when someone's words have lived rent-free in your head for months, words that told you were stupid, unqualified, ugly, replaceable, it takes more than one suspension notice to evict them. Even now, I'd occasionally catch myself flinching when my phone buzzed after hours, expecting another one of her impossible demands. But this time, it wasn't her. It was David. Quick chat this afternoon? I met him in his office at 2:00. The blinds were half drawn, the air thick with something unsaid. He gestured for me to sit. I wanted to give you an update before you hear it elsewhere. He slid a printed document across his desk. It was a formal summary from HR's investigation. Dozens of employee interviews, written statements, evidence logs, and Rachel's name at the center of it all. She's not coming back, he said, his voice calm. We've decided to terminate her contract. Effective immediately. I blinked. Not because I was surprised, but because it was real. Finally, undeniably real. David continued. We discovered that she had been recording private team meetings without consent. She also deleted project files out of spite when she was reassigned from key initiatives. But the worst? She tried to sabotage your onboarding. He handed me another document, an email, this one uncovered from her work archive, to internal communications. Subject, director profile, request for revisions. Please reconsider highlighting Lisa Grant in the newsletter. She's not respected by the team and has a history of insubordination. Elevating her might undermine leadership credibility. It was dated a week before the newsletter went out. She had actively tried to rewrite my reputation behind the scenes. David shook his head. She underestimated how many people were ready to speak up this time. Her entire former team provided written statements. And your resignation letter? It's being used as a training case in HR now. I sat back in my chair, the weight of it all pressing down. She was gone. She couldn't touch me anymore. But the scars? They hadn't vanished. Later that day, I found myself in the break room alone, staring into my coffee like it held answers. Brian walked in, the manager who had originally hired me, the one who'd tried to protect me even when his hands were tied. He smiled gently. Heard the news? I nodded. You earned this, Lisa. The way you handled yourself, not many could have done it. I looked at him. Do you ever wonder why she lasted as long as she did? He didn't hesitate. Because people were afraid, and because no one in power wanted to deal with the mess. Until you. I didn't respond right away. Because the truth is, I had been afraid too. Terrified. But fear had eventually turned into something else. Resolve. Maybe even courage. Over the next week, cleanup began. Projects Rachel had derailed were reassigned. Former employees reached out to say thank you. For speaking up. For not letting her win. Some even asked if they could return now that the atmosphere had changed. And it had changed. There was a lightness in the office now. A sense of permission. Permission to ask questions. To challenge ideas. To not walk on eggshells. Still, one final surprise was waiting. On Monday morning, I opened my inbox to find an email forwarded from David. It was from Rachel. Subject, exit process. Before my departure is finalized, I want to lodge a formal objection. Lisa Grant manipulated the situation to get rid of me. She's unqualified and vindictive. I will be pursuing legal options. I read the message twice, and then I laughed. Because what she didn't realize, what she never understood, was that power built on fear crumbles the moment people stop being afraid. I forwarded it to legal with a simple note. Please see attached. Happy to provide any documentation you need. By the end of the day, legal responded. Thank you, Lisa. Based on the volume of evidence and third-party reports, we're confident in our position. No further action required. No further action. That phrase echoed in my mind, not just because the case was closed, but because for the first time in over a year, I could finally breathe without waiting for the next blow. Rachel's story at Aerden was over. A month had passed since Rachel's termination. Her name no longer came up in meetings. Her picture was removed from the internal org chart. Her office, once a space people entered with dread, had been quietly reassigned to a new hire. Someone kind, collaborative, human. The fear she had ruled with? Gone. But the shift didn't just live in the org chart or team meetings. It was in the way people stood taller, spoke more freely, and dared to raise concerns without bracing for retaliation. It was in the way I started sleeping again. No 10 p.m. texts, no acid in my stomach before Monday mornings, no second-guessing my own worth. I had found my voice, and I wasn't giving it up. A few weeks later, David called me into his office. He smiled as I sat down and handed me a sleek invitation envelope. I opened it and read, Women in Leadership Annual Summit, Panel Invitation Topic, Resilience and Reinvention, Stories from the Front Lines, featuring Lisa Grant, Director of Strategic Operations, Aerden Tech. I looked up, stunned. You submitted my name? David nodded. Actually, one of your former colleagues did. HR passed along your resignation letter to them as a case study. They were so impressed, they reached out directly. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Me. The woman who once cried in her car after Rachel called her a waste of a salary. Now being asked to speak about resilience. I said yes. The day of the summit, I stood backstage in a crisp navy suit, my hands lightly trembling. Not with fear, but energy, anticipation. A full room of professionals waited just beyond the curtain. Some probably facing the same battles I had barely survived. I took a breath and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight warmed my skin. The mic in my hand felt oddly natural. Good morning, I began. I want to tell you a story. Not because it's unique, but because it's far too common. The room went still. I was once called unqualified by a manager who feared I might outshine her. I was told to work through weekends, to cancel vacations, to be small. I did the work. I stayed silent. Until I couldn't anymore. I scanned the crowd. Hundreds of eyes locked on me. I wrote a resignation letter. Not to burn bridges, but to leave a trail. I documented everything. Every insult, every overreach, every ounce of disrespect. A quiet hum of agreement rippled through the room. And for a while, I thought that would be the end of my story. But it wasn't. A door opened. A chance to return. This time, with power. With a voice. And when I saw the person who once humiliated me, I didn't lash out. I did something much harder. I paused. I stayed steady. I let the truth speak. I did the work again. And this time, people listened. The applause began softly, then grew. But I wasn't finished. I'm not here to tell you that justice always comes quickly. It doesn't. I spent nights eating toast for dinner because we couldn't afford groceries. I applied to 20 jobs a day with no replies. I doubted everything about myself. I let the words land. But I'm also not here to tell you to stay silent, to wait for someone else to fix it. Because the truth is, your voice matters, even when it shakes. Especially when it shakes. I smiled then. For real. I stand here today not as someone who won, but as someone who refused to lose. When the panel ended, people approached me with tears in their eyes. One young woman whispered, "Thank you. I've been afraid to speak up, but now I think I can. That moment, that sentence, meant more than any title ever could. A few weeks later, Aerden Tech announced a new company-wide policy on workplace culture, developed in collaboration with HR and me. It included stronger reporting procedures, anonymous feedback tools, and leadership accountability tracking. The company even introduced a quarterly workshop titled The Cost of Silence: How to Spot and Stop Toxic Leadership. They asked me to help design the first one. I did. Not for revenge, not to relive the past, but so no one else would have to. 1 year after my return, I sat in my office, the real one with glass walls and a skyline view, and reviewed a resume from a candidate applying to join my team. At the bottom of her cover letter, she had written, "I read about your story in last year's Leadership Summit. It changed the way I advocate for myself." Thank you, I leaned back, eyes stinging. Rachel was a chapter, but I was the author now. And my story? It was just beginning.